Officer Jason Kane sat in his patrol car, the soft hum of the engine vibrating through the seat, his fingers tapping impatiently on the steering wheel. The night shift dragged on, just as dull as every other in Millstone Heights. The night was unremarkable, quiet, still, and suffused with the kind of decay that seeped into every crack of the aging brick buildings and shuttered storefronts. He wasn't optimistic. To Jason, this neighborhood was a lost cause. The crime, the neglect, it all blurred together into a mural of failure. The system was broken, the people here were complacent, and it was all a reminder of why he had stopped caring long ago. His nightly rounds had become routine, a going-through-the-motions existence where each uneventful shift only fueled his bitterness. As the patrol car turned onto Lincoln Avenue, something caught his eye. A solitary figure standing outside a darkened corner store. The flickering streetlight overhead cast uneven shadows, but Jason could make out the slight stoop of the woman's back, the oversized coat that swallowed her frame, and the cane she leaned on for support. In her other hand, she clutched a plastic grocery bag, its contents barely discernible. Jason's brow furrowed. What's she doing out here at this hour? It was nearing midnight, and there was no legitimate reason for anyone to be loitering in this part of town. His instincts, honed more by suspicion than wisdom, told him she didn't belong. He parked the car across the street, his grip tightening on the steering wheel as he observed her movements, or lack thereof. She wasn't doing anything, just shifting her weight slightly as if waiting for something or someone. Jason's unease grew, his sense of authority mixed with frustration and a vague need to remind her of her place. He stepped out of the car, the sound of his boots against the pavement breaking the silence of the night. As he crossed the street, the figure barely reacted. Her head turned slightly, just enough for him to catch a glimpse of her face. Older, lined with years, and calm in a way that unsettled him. "Hey," Jason called out, his voice sharp and authoritative as he closed the distance. "What are you doing here?" The woman straightened slowly, her movements deliberate but unhurried. Up close, she looked even older than Jason had first thought, her face framed by stray gray hairs escaping from under her wide-brimmed hat. Despite her frailty, there was an air of quiet dignity about her that Jason found both puzzling and irritating. "I'm just heading home," she said softly, her voice calm but firm. Jason scoffed, narrowing his eyes. "Home? At this hour? This isn't exactly the safest place for a late-night stroll." "I'm aware," she replied, her tone unwavering. "But I had some errands to run." Jason's gaze flicked to the grocery bag in her hand. It didn't look suspicious, but that wasn't the point. Her calm demeanor was getting under his skin. Most people in this neighborhood knew to defer to him, to give him the respect, or fear, he demanded. But this woman standing there with her quiet composure seemed completely unaffected by his presence. "What's in the bag?" he asked, taking a step closer. She lifted the bag slightly, showing its contents: a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a few canned goods. "Just groceries," she said. Jason's jaw tightened. He knew there was nothing inherently wrong with her being here, but something about her refusal to cower irked him. He stepped closer, his posture stiffening as he tried to assert his authority. "You got ID?" The woman sighed softly and reached into her coat, pulling out a worn wallet. She handed him her identification without a word, her calm gaze fixed on his face. Jason glanced at the card. Eleanor Price, local address. Nothing suspicious. But he wasn't satisfied. Handing the ID back with a sharp flick of his wrist, he leaned in, his voice lowering into a growl. "Why are you really here? Don't give me some story about groceries." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her expression one of quiet patience. "Officer Kane?" she said, her tone gentle but deliberate. "I've told you the truth. There's no need for this." The sound of his name from her lips startled Jason. He hadn't introduced himself, and his name tag wasn't visible in the dim light. "How does she know who I am?" he wondered, the thought sparking a flicker of unease. "I'll decide what there's a need for," he snapped, stepping even closer. The air between them was thick with tension now, and Jason's pulse quickened. He needed to regain control of the situation, to assert his dominance in the way he always did when things felt out of hand. When Eleanor didn't back down, he reached out suddenly, grabbing her arm. The movement was forceful, almost instinctive, and Eleanor staggered slightly, her cane wobbling as she struggled to keep her balance. The plastic bag fell from her hand, its contents spilling onto the pavement. Jason tightened his grip, his frustration boiling over. "You think you can just stand here and act like you're untouchable?" he hissed. "You don't get to ignore me." For the first time, a flicker of pain crossed Eleanor's face, but she quickly composed herself. Her calm gaze locked onto Jason's, unflinching despite the pressure of his grip. "Let go of me," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the situation. Jason hesitated for a moment, his own anger warring with the growing discomfort her composure instilled in him. Finally, he released her arm with a sharp movement, stepping back as if to regain control of himself. Eleanor steadied herself, bending down slowly to pick up her cane. She straightened, her eyes never leaving Jason's. "You don't know what you're doing, Officer Kane," she said softly. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning Jason couldn't quite place. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Eleanor reached into her coat again. Jason's hand instinctively moved toward his belt, ready to reach for his weapon, but what she pulled out stopped him cold, and it wasn't a weapon, it was a badge. Gleaming and unmistakable, an FBI insignia shining faintly under the flickering streetlight. Jason stared, his mind racing to process what he was seeing. His pulse thundered in his ears as Eleanor held up the badge for him to see, her calm gaze piercing through him. "Special Agent Eleanor Price," she said evenly, "and I think you've just made a very big mistake." The weight of her words hit Jason like a freight train, and for the first time that night, he felt the full gravity of his actions. The silence between Jason Kane and Eleanor Price was suffocating, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the chilled night air. The FBI badge gleamed in her hand, reflecting the pale flicker of the street lamp above. Jason's chest tightened, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. He blinked, trying to reconcile the frail, elderly woman he had just grabbed with the federal agent standing before him. "This has to be a joke," Jason muttered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his disbelief. His hand hovered near his belt, unsure whether to retreat or stand his ground. "FBI? Really?" Eleanor didn't flinch. Her calm gaze stayed locked on his, steady and unwavering. "Special Agent Eleanor Price," she repeated, her tone measured but with an edge of steel. "I'm investigating corruption within the Millstone Heights Police Department. You've just become part of the case, Officer Kane." Jason's head spun. This couldn't be happening. His career, his entire life, flashed before his eyes. The sting of adrenaline surged through him, followed by a deep, gnawing panic. "You're bluffing," he spat, though even he didn't believe the words. He gestured toward the badge with a sneer. "Anyone can flash a fake badge." Eleanor raised a brow, a faint trace of disappointment flickering across her face. She reached into her coat again and produced a folded piece of paper. Carefully, she opened it and held it out to him. Jason hesitated before snatching the paper, his fingers trembling slightly as he scanned the text. It was an official FBI identification card, complete with a photograph of Eleanor, her name, and the Bureau's unmistakable seal. It was authentic, unquestionably so. "You're kidding me," he mumbled, his throat dry. His eyes darted from the document to Eleanor, then back again. His anger surged, born of fear and a desperate attempt to regain control. "You can't just walk around pretending to be—" "I'm not pretending, Officer Kane," Eleanor interrupted, her tone cutting through his bluster. "But you? You just crossed a line, and I don't mean the kind of line you can walk back over." Jason took a step back, the reality of the situation hitting him like a physical blow. He had grabbed her, he had assaulted a federal agent. And if her investigation was what she claimed, this wasn't just an embarrassing mistake. It was career-ending. Worse than that, it was criminal. "You don't understand," Jason began, his voice faltering. "I didn't—" Eleanor's sharp voice cut him off again. "You didn't what? Didn't think? Didn't care? Or didn't expect anyone to hold you accountable?" Her words struck Jason like a whip. He had spent years walking these streets, issuing commands and expecting obedience. The idea that someone, let alone a federal agent, could challenge him, let alone expose him, was unthinkable. Eleanor took a step closer, her cane clicking softly against the pavement. She didn't need height or physical strength to command authority. Her words carried all the weight of someone who had seen it all. "You think you're the first officer to act like this, like your badge gives you the right to intimidate anyone you want? You think you're untouchable?" Jason's lips parted to respond, but no words came out. He had been conditioned to enforce authority, to take control of every situation. Yet now, stripped of his power, he felt small and vulnerable. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone," he said finally, though the words sounded weak even to him. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You weren't trying to hurt anyone. You grabbed me. You bruised me. What were you trying to do, Officer Kane? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you were trying to prove something." Jason felt his face flush with shame and anger. He clenched his fists, the emotions swirling inside him almost too much to bear. "You don't know anything about me." "No," Eleanor replied evenly, "but I know your type. Officers like you make my job easier. You're predictable. You operate on fear and control, and the moment you lose either, you spiral." Jason opened his mouth to argue, but she raised a hand, silencing him. "Do you know why I'm here, Officer Kane?" Eleanor's voice softened, but the steel in her tone remained. "I'm here because this precinct has a reputation. Complaints disappear. Officers like you operate with impunity. People in this community have suffered because of the corruption within these walls, and I'm here to put an end to it." Her words hit Jason like a punch to the gut. He had heard the rumors, of course, the murmurs of investigations, the whispers about federal eyes watching their department, but he had never thought it would come to this. "What do you want from me?" Jason asked finally, his voice a low growl. "I want you to think very carefully about your next steps," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but deliberate. "You've got a choice, Kane. Cooperate with me, or dig yourself an even deeper hole. And trust me, that hole is already pretty deep." Jason stared at her, his mind racing. He could deny everything, call her bluff, and hope for the best, or he could face the reality that his life as he knew it was over. The weight of her words crushed him, and for the first time in his career, Jason felt truly powerless. Before he could respond, Eleanor stepped back, tucking her badge and ID into her coat. "We'll be talking again, Officer Kane," she said. "You can count on that." Without another word, she turned and walked away, her cane tapping softly against the pavement. Jason stood frozen in place, watching her retreat into the shadows, the reality of his situation sinking in. When he finally turned back toward his squad car, his legs felt like lead. He climbed into the driver's seat and sat there, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The quiet hum of the engine returned, vibrating through the seat, but it did nothing to steady his racing thoughts. All he could see was the gleam of Eleanor's badge and the cold certainty in her eyes. Jason Kane had made a mistake, a monumental mistake, and there was no going back. The morning after the confrontation between Officer Jason Kane and Special Agent Eleanor Price, Millstone Heights was buzzing with unrest. Word of Jason's assault on an undercover FBI agent spread rapidly, traveling through the tight-knit community like wildfire. By dawn, the local news had picked up the story, flashing his face on the screen alongside headlines like, "Corruption in Millstone Heights? FBI launches investigation into local police department." Jason sat slumped in a holding cell at the precinct, his hands trembling as he ran them through his hair. He could hear the distant hum of voices from the front of the building, the murmurs of his fellow officers who were trying to make sense of what had happened. His chest felt tight, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical burden. He had always thought of himself as untouchable, but now his entire world was unraveling. Through the small, grimy window of his cell, Jason could see shadows moving outside. The first protesters had already gathered, angry residents holding hand-painted signs that read, "Justice for Millstone Heights," and "End Police Corruption." Their voices rose in a chorus of chants, each word hammering against Jason's skull. A community ignites. On the steps of the precinct, a woman named Carla Johnson stood holding a megaphone. Carla was a longtime community organizer and a familiar face in Millstone Heights. Her voice carried with the raw emotion of someone who had spent years advocating for change in a system that seemed designed to crush her and her neighbors. "We've been saying this for years," Carla shouted into the megaphone. "The corruption in this department is real. The abuse, the cover-ups, It's been going on for far too long, and now we finally have proof. It's time for accountability." The crowd cheered, their energy palpable. Dozens of residents joined the growing protest, some clutching signs while others brought water bottles and chairs, preparing for a long fight. Local journalists milled about, capturing every angle of the scene, their cameras zeroing in on the anger etched into the faces of the protesters. Inside the precinct, Lieutenant Adam Harlow watched the commotion from the safety of his office. His jaw was clenched, his fingers tapping restlessly against his desk. The investigation had been looming for months, but this was chaos. Jason Kane's reckless actions had brought the FBI's scrutiny directly to their doorstep, threatening to expose everything. Harlow's phone buzzed. He snatched it up, barking into the receiver. "What is it?" The voice on the other end, one of his trusted officers, spoke quickly. "Sir, it's getting worse. The FBI is pulling records. Price and her team are combing through everything. Complaints, incident reports, payroll logs. If they find—" "They won't," Harlow interrupted sharply. "I've already taken care of the files. Just stick to the plan and keep your head down." He hung up, his mind racing. For years, Harlow had operated in the shadows, covering for officers like Jason Kane, erasing complaints, and ensuring the department's dirty laundry stayed hidden. But now, the walls were closing in. Jason had hoped for some kind of solidarity from his colleagues, but as the hours ticked by, it became clear that he was alone. The precinct was eerily silent, save for the occasional shuffle of papers or the muffled ring of a phone. No one came to check on him, and when he did catch glimpses of familiar faces, they quickly looked away, avoiding his gaze. He felt like a pariah, a scapegoat. Around midday, 2 officers entered the holding area, their expressions grim. Jason's stomach churned as he recognized them as internal affairs investigators. "Officer Kane," one of them said, his voice clipped. "We need to ask you some questions." Jason stiffened, his mind flashing back to Eleanor Price's cold stare and her damning words. He didn't know who to trust anymore. Every move he made felt like it was tightening the noose around his neck. "I have nothing to say," Jason muttered, turning away. "Suit yourself," the officer replied, his tone laced with contempt. "But I hope you realize you're not the one we're after. If you cooperate, we might be able to work something out. If not, well, you know how this ends." Jason's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. Deep down, he knew the investigator was right. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Harlow and the corrupt network that had shielded him for years. But Jason wasn't ready to make that leap, not yet. Meanwhile, in a conference room at the FBI's temporary office in Millstone Heights, Eleanor Price and her team pored over documents and surveillance footage. The walls were lined with corkboards, each one covered in photographs, maps, and timelines connecting key players in the precinct's corruption. Eleanor stood at the head of the table, her bruised face a stark reminder of the confrontation with Jason. Despite the pain, she was focused, her sharp eyes scanning every detail. "Jason Kane is a symptom," Eleanor said, her voice calm but firm. "Harlow is the disease. He's been covering for these officers, burying complaints and running this department like his own personal fiefdom, but we're going to bring him down." An agent across the table spoke up, holding a folder. "We found discrepancies in Harlow's financial records. He's been receiving payments from known criminal organizations, kickbacks, bribes, you name it." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's a start. What about Jason? Is he talking?" The agent shook his head. "Not yet. He's scared, but he's still loyal, for now." Eleanor exhaled sharply. She knew they were running out of time. Harlow wouldn't wait for the investigation to close in on him. He would act, and Jason was the most vulnerable link in the chain. Back in his office, Harlow paced restlessly. He had spent years perfecting the art of survival, navigating the precarious balance of power in the department. But Jason's blunder had thrown everything into chaos. He picked up his phone, dialing a number from memory. The voice on the other end answered quickly. "I need this handled," Harlow said, his voice low and urgent. "Kane's a liability. If he flips, we're all done." The voice responded with a curt, "Understood." Harlow ended the call, his jaw tightening as he stared out the window at the growing protest outside. He knew what needed to be done. Desperate times called for desperate measures. As the sun began to set, the crowd outside the precinct swelled. The chants grew louder, demanding justice not just for Eleanor Price, but for all the residents who had suffered under the precinct's corrupt practices. Inside his cell, Jason could hear the noise, the distant echoes of voices shouting his name. He pressed his hands to his temples, trying to block it out. But the weight of his choices was inescapable. For years he had turned a blind eye to the complaints, the whispers of abuse and corruption. He had justified it as part of the job, a necessary evil to maintain control. But now, sitting in that cell, he wondered if it had all been a lie. Jason Kane was trapped between the corrupt system that had protected him and the relentless force of justice closing in. And deep down, he knew the ripples of his actions were just beginning to spread. The FBI office buzzed with activity as Eleanor Price's team pushed forward with the investigation. The walls of the command center were plastered with photos, maps, and notes linking Lieutenant Adam Harlow to a web of corruption that spanned years. Every piece of evidence pointed to him as the mastermind behind a precinct riddled with payoffs, false reports, and suppressed complaints. Eleanor stood at the head of the table, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "We're running out of time. Harlow knows we're onto him, and if we don't act soon, he'll cover his tracks. Or worse." An agent seated nearby tapped a document in front of him. "We've tracked payments from Harlow's personal account to a series of shell companies. We believe these were used to funnel bribes from criminal organizations, and here," he pointed to a timeline on the board, "are complaints about Officer Kane and other officers, all of which were mysteriously resolved under Harlow's watch." Eleanor's brow furrowed. "It's all circumstantial for now. We need someone on the inside to confirm how deep this goes. Kane could give us that, if he talks." Another agent, Agent Davis, chimed in. "Harlow's already trying to protect himself. He's been in contact with a burner phone linked to a known enforcer, a guy with a history of silencing problems like this. If he gets to Kane first—" Eleanor cut him off, her voice firm. "We can't let that happen. Kane's life is in danger, and he might be the only way to bring Harlow down. We have to get through to him." Jason Kane sat alone in his cell, the dim light casting shadows across his face. He hadn't slept. The fear gnawed at him like a persistent ache. Every sound in the hallway, every distant voice, every jangling key set his nerves on edge. He knew he was being watched, but he also knew who he had to fear the most: Harlow. Jason had seen what happened to people who crossed Harlow. Officers who stepped out of line didn't last long, and civilians who dared to file complaints found themselves mysteriously silenced. He had turned a blind eye to it for years, telling himself it wasn't his problem. But now, with the FBI breathing down his neck, Jason realized he wasn't just a cog in the machine. He was expendable. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Jason's heart raced. He pressed his back against the wall, his fists clenching as the cell door swung open. Instead of a threat, he saw Eleanor Price standing there, flanked by 2 FBI agents. She stepped inside, her expression unreadable, and gestured for the guards to close the door behind her. Jason stared at her, his jaw tight. "What do you want?" Eleanor crossed her arms, her bruised cheek a stark reminder of their last encounter. "What I want, Jason, is for you to make a decision. The right one." Jason scoffed, looking away. "You think I'm just going to flip on Harlow? You don't get it. If I talk, I'm dead. You can't protect me from him." Eleanor stepped closer, her voice quiet but unyielding. "You're already a dead man if you stay silent. Harlow isn't going to let you walk away from this. The moment you became a liability, you signed your own death warrant. The only way out of this is to help us take him down." Jason's hands trembled as he rubbed his temples. He had spent years building his career, burying complaints and justifying his actions. But now, the weight of it all was crushing him. "You don't understand," he muttered. "Harlow's got connections everywhere. Even if I talk, what's stopping him from coming after me? After my family?" Eleanor crouched down to his level, her eyes locking onto his. "Me," she said firmly. "I am. You think I haven't dealt with men like Harlow before? I've taken down entire networks of corruption that make this precinct look like child's play. But I can't do it without you. You have the chance to end this, to expose the truth, but you have to trust me." Jason's chest rose and fell rapidly, his mind racing. Could he trust her? Could the FBI really protect him? Deep down, he knew Eleanor was right. Harlow would never let him walk away unscathed, but flipping on him meant betraying everything he had stood for, everything he thought had kept him safe. "I need time," Jason whispered, his voice shaky. "You don't have time," Eleanor replied sharply. "Harlow's already making his move. If you want to survive this, you need to act now." Eleanor left Jason's cell with a sinking feeling in her chest. He was close, so close to flipping, but the fear of Harlow's retribution was holding him back. She knew they had to act quickly, or they would lose him. That night, the precinct was eerily quiet. Most of the officers had gone home, leaving behind a skeleton crew to handle overnight duties. Jason lay on his cot, his eyes darting to the shadows cast by the flickering light in the hallway. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the faint creak of a door. Jason sat up, his pulse quickening. Footsteps echoed softly, growing louder with each step. A figure appeared outside his cell, and Jason's heart sank as he recognized the man, one of Harlow's enforcers. The man said nothing as he unlocked the cell door, stepping inside with a deliberate calmness that sent a chill down Jason's spine. Jason scrambled to his feet, his back pressed against the wall. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The enforcer smirked, pulling a silenced pistol from his coat. "Just cleaning up a loose end." Jason's eyes widened as the reality of the situation hit him. He tried to move, to fight back, but the enforcer was too fast. A single shot rang out, muffled by the suppressor. Jason crumpled to the ground, his body motionless. The enforcer slipped out of the cell as silently as he had entered, leaving behind nothing but Jason's lifeless body and a chilling message for anyone who dared to cross Harlow. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the precinct to oversee Jason's transfer to a secure federal facility. As she entered the holding area, her heart dropped. The scene before her was hauntingly quiet, but the open cell door told her something was wrong. "Jason?" she called out, her voice echoing down the hallway. When she reached his cell, she froze. Jason's body lay sprawled on the floor, a dark pool of blood beneath him. Her stomach twisted as she knelt beside him, her fingers brushing against his cold skin. It was too late. Eleanor clenched her fists, her jaw tightening with a mix of anger and grief. Harlow had struck again, silencing the one person who could have brought him down. As she stood, her resolve hardened. "You're not getting away with this, Harlow," she whispered. "I'll make sure of it." Eleanor knew the fight wasn't over. Jason's death was a devastating blow, but it was also the spark she needed to redouble her efforts. Harlow had made his move, and now it was her turn to strike back. The air in the FBI command center was tense, thick with determination and urgency. Jason Kane's death had rattled the entire team, fueling their resolve to take down Lieutenant Adam Harlow and dismantle the corrupt network he had built. Eleanor Price stood at the center of the room, her bruised face a visible reminder of the stakes as agents combed through the evidence they had gathered. "Steele's murder is a declaration," Eleanor said, her voice sharp but controlled. "Harlow is trying to scare us off. He thinks silencing Kane will stop us from uncovering the truth. He's wrong." Agent Davis tapped the whiteboard filled with a sprawling web of connections, names, dates, locations, all pointing back to Harlow. "We've traced Harlow's burner phone activity," he said. "It's connected to multiple enforcers, including the one we believe eliminated Kane. Payments to these individuals are coming from an offshore account under Harlow's control." Another agent chimed in, flipping through financial documents. "And it doesn't stop there. Harlow's account is tied to payouts funneled through shell companies. These payments match dates when complaints against officers were mysteriously dropped or investigations into misconduct were quietly closed." Eleanor's jaw tightened. She had suspected the corruption went deep, but now it was staring her in the face. "What about the ledger?" she asked, referring to the notebook she had recovered from Harlow's office during their initial investigation. Agent Patel, the team's forensic accountant, held up the leather-bound book. "This ledger is the key. It lists payouts to officers, including Kane, and even references bribes from local businesses and criminal organizations. Harlow wasn't just covering for his officers, he was running a criminal enterprise from inside the precinct. Eleanor glanced at the names listed in the ledger. Some were already known to her, but others were new. Each one represented a piece of the puzzle, a cog in the machine that Harlow had built. "We need to move fast," she said. "Harlow knows we're closing in, and if we don't act now, he'll destroy the remaining evidence." Across town, Harlow sat in his dimly lit office, his expression grim as he scrolled through messages on his phone. The precinct was quieter than usual. Officers kept their heads down, aware that the FBI's shadow loomed large over the building. Harlow, however, wasn't just worried. He was desperate. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and one of his trusted officers, Sergeant Dean Harper, stepped inside. Harper's face was pale, his demeanor jittery. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice low. "The FBI's digging deeper. They've already connected your account to the payouts." Harlow leaned back in his chair, his face tightening with frustration. "I know," he growled. "What about Kane? That should have slowed them down." Harper hesitated, then shook his head. "It didn't. If anything, they're more aggressive now. They've got a ledger from your office, names, numbers. It's bad, Adam." For the first time, a flicker of fear crossed Harlow's face. He had always prided himself on being untouchable, on staying 3 steps ahead of anyone who dared challenge him. But now, the walls were closing in. "Get rid of everything else," he ordered. "Files, phones, anything that can tie me to this. Make sure the others know. If anyone talks, they're done." Harper nodded quickly, but his nervous energy betrayed him. Harlow narrowed his eyes, leaning forward. "You're not losing your nerve on me, are you, Dean?" "No, sir," Harper replied, though his voice wavered. "I'm with you." Harlow didn't look convinced. "Good. Because if you even think about flipping, I'll make sure you regret it." Back at the FBI command center, the mood shifted as Agent Patel burst into the room holding a printout. "We've got him," she announced, her excitement cutting through the tension. Eleanor turned to her, her eyes sharp. "What do you have?" Patel spread out the documents on the table, pointing to a series of transactions flagged by their forensic team. Harlow's offshore account made a large transfer 2 days ago to a known associate of his, an enforcer we believe is tied to multiple disappearances. We tracked this associate's movements and found security footage of him entering the precinct the night Kane was killed. The room buzzed with energy as the agents processed the information. Davis added, "We've also intercepted a message from Harlow to his network instructing them to destroy evidence and go underground. He's panicking." Eleanor nodded, her mind racing. This was the break they needed. With the ledger, financial records, and now the connection to Kane's murder, they had enough to take Harlow down. But they couldn't stop there. They needed to ensure the entire network was exposed and dismantled. "Prepare the warrants," Eleanor said, her voice resolute. "We're raiding the precinct tonight. Harlow thinks he can destroy the evidence, but we're going to catch him before he gets the chance." As the team finalized their plans, Eleanor pulled Harris aside. "We need to be ready for anything," she said. "Harlow isn't going down without a fight. He's dangerous and he's desperate." Harris nodded, his expression serious. "We've got backup on standby and the SWAT team is ready to move in. But you're right. This won't be easy." Eleanor glanced at the map of the precinct, her thoughts lingering on Jason Kane. He had been a part of this corrupt system, yes, but he had also been a victim of it. His death was a stark reminder of what they were up against. "This ends tonight," she said softly, her resolve unwavering. As the agents suited up and prepared for the raid, Eleanor felt a mix of anticipation and unease. The pieces were finally falling into place, but she knew the fight wasn't over. Taking down Harlow was just the beginning. The real work, rebuilding trust and reforming the system, would come next. But for now, Eleanor focused on the task at hand. Harlow's time was up, and she was going to make sure he paid for everything he had done. The FBI's command van was parked just blocks away from the Millstone Heights precinct, buzzing with activity. Inside, monitors displayed live feeds from drones and body cameras, offering a full view of the building and surrounding area. The clock ticked closer to midnight as Eleanor Price stood with her team briefing the agents one last time. "Lieutenant Harlow has spent years building his operation," Eleanor said, her voice calm but firm. "He's corrupt, calculating, and desperate. We've got the evidence to bring him down, but we can't underestimate him. This raid is about more than Harlow. It's about dismantling an entire system. Stay focused, stay alert, and trust your training." Her words hung in the air as the team nodded, their faces set with determination. Harris stood at her side, scanning the map of the precinct laid out on the table. "We've got teams on every entrance," he said. "No one's getting in or out without us knowing." Eleanor adjusted her tactical vest and nodded. "Let's move." The night air was thick with tension as the FBI team approached the precinct. Agents in black tactical gear moved silently, their weapons at the ready. The precinct loomed ahead, its exterior dark and imposing. Inside, the night shift was in full swing, officers working late, unaware of the storm about to descend. Eleanor led the main entry team, her heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and resolve. As they reached the front doors, Harris gave the signal. The breach team swung into action, slamming a battering ram against the door. The sound echoed through the quiet street as the door burst open and agents poured inside. "FBI, everyone stay where you are," Eleanor shouted, her voice ringing out over the chaos. Officers froze in place, their faces a mix of shock and confusion. Some instinctively reached for their radios or weapons but quickly dropped their hands as agents surrounded them. "Hands up, step away from your desks," Harris barked, corralling the officers into a corner of the room. The team split into groups, sweeping the building room by room. Eleanor moved swiftly toward Harlow's office, her weapon drawn, flanked by 2 agents. The hallways were eerily quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by the sound of boots on the tiled floor and the occasional crackle of radios. Eleanor reached Harlow's office and signaled for the agents to take position. The door was closed and she could hear faint movement inside. She took a deep breath, then knocked sharply. "Lieutenant Harlow, this is the FBI. Open the door." There was no response, only the sound of rustling papers. Eleanor nodded to the breach agent, who kicked the door open with a resounding crash. Inside, Harlow was at his desk, a handgun resting beside him. His face was pale, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. He looked up, his eyes locking onto Eleanor's. "You've got some nerve, Agent Price," Harlow said, his voice low and dangerous. "Breaking into my precinct like this." Eleanor kept her weapon trained on him, her voice steady. "It's over, Harlow. We have everything, your financial records, the ledger, your connection to Kane's murder. Put your hands where I can see them." Harlow chuckled bitterly, shaking his head. "You think you've won? You don't know how deep this goes. Take me down and someone else will step in. That's how this works." "Maybe," Eleanor replied. "But tonight, it's you. Hands. Now." For a moment it seemed like Harlow might resist, his hand hovering near the gun on his desk. The tension in the room was palpable, the agents ready to fire at the slightest provocation. But then, Harlow sighed and raised his hands, the fight draining from his posture. Harris stepped forward and cuffed Harlow, pulling him to his feet. "Adam Harlow, you're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and murder. You have the right to remain silent." Harlow cut him off with a sneer. "Save the speech, it's not over." As Harlow was escorted out of the building, Eleanor and her team began searching his office for additional evidence. They combed through drawers, filing cabinets, and his computer, piecing together the full extent of his operations. It didn't take long for them to find what they were looking for. "Agent Price," one of the agents called, holding up a USB drive. "This has everything. Emails, transaction records, communications with his enforcers." Eleanor took the drive, her chest tightening with a mix of relief and determination. This was the final piece, the undeniable proof of Harlow's crimes. She slipped it into an evidence bag and secured it in her vest. As she looked around the office, her eyes landed on a framed photo on Harlow's desk, a younger Harlow standing with a group of officers, their smiles wide and proud. It was a stark contrast to the man he had become, For a brief moment, Eleanor wondered what had led him down this path, what had made him trade integrity for power. But she quickly pushed the thought aside. Tonight wasn't about sympathy. It was about justice. Outside the precinct, a crowd had gathered, their chants echoing through the night. "Justice for Millstone Heights!" they shouted, their voices filled with anger and hope. News cameras captured the scene as Harlow was led out in handcuffs, flanked by agents. The crowd erupted, some cheering, others jeering, but all united in their demand for accountability. For years, the people of Millstone Heights had lived under the shadow of corruption, their voices ignored. Tonight, they were finally being heard. Eleanor stood on the steps of the precinct, watching as Harlow was loaded into the waiting FBI van. Harris joined her, his expression a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. "It's done," he said quietly. "Not yet," Eleanor replied, her eyes on the crowd. "This is just the beginning." As the team packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, Eleanor took a moment to address the gathered residents. Stepping forward, she raised her hands, signaling for quiet. "We hear you," she said, her voice strong and clear. "This is a step toward justice, but it's not the end. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without you. Keep holding us accountable. Keep fighting for what's right." The crowd responded with applause and cheers, their energy palpable. Eleanor felt a flicker of hope. For the first time in years, it seemed like real change was possible. As the FBI convoy drove away from the precinct, Eleanor sat in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, the USB drive secure in her pocket. She stared out the window, her mind racing with thoughts of what came next. Harlow's arrest was a victory, but the fight was far from over. There were still officers to investigate, reforms to implement, and trust to rebuild. But for now, Eleanor allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Tonight, they had taken a powerful step toward dismantling a broken system. And tomorrow, they would continue the fight. The days following Lieutenant Harlow's arrest were a whirlwind of activity. The FBI's investigation into Millstone Heights precinct expanded rapidly, uncovering more evidence of systemic corruption. Officers implicated in Harlow's network were suspended, pending further investigation. The names from Harlow's ledger, the digital files on his computer, and testimony from whistleblowers painted a damning picture of a department rotting from the inside. Margaret Carter, the interim chief brought in to lead the reform effort, stood in the precinct's main hall addressing her newly restructured team. She was a sharp, no-nonsense leader with a reputation for integrity. "This department has failed its community," Margaret said, her voice steady and resolute. "But failure is not where this story ends. From this moment on, we rebuild, with honesty, accountability, and respect as our foundation." Eleanor Price watched from the back of the room, her arms crossed, her heart heavy but hopeful. She had seen departments like this before, ones where corruption ran deep, infecting even those who wanted to do the right thing. Change wouldn't come easily, but it was possible. And that hope was enough to keep her going. Outside the precinct, the protests had shifted tone. The anger that once fueled them was now tempered by cautious optimism. Community leaders began working with federal oversight teams to establish new policies and ensure transparency. Town halls were held in local schools and churches, giving residents a chance to voice their concerns directly to law enforcement. Eleanor attended one of these meetings, held in a high school gymnasium packed with residents. The air was charged with a mix of tension and hope. An elderly man raised his hand to speak, his voice trembling with emotion. "We've been calling out for help for years," he said, "and no one listened. How do we know this time is different?" Margaret Carter stood to respond, but Eleanor stepped forward first. "Because you're not alone this time," Eleanor said, her voice firm but warm. "We've seen what happens when power is unchecked, when the people tasked with protecting a community use that power to harm instead. We're not just here to promise change, we're here to make it happen. But we can't do it without you." The room erupted into applause, a wave of tentative hope sweeping through the crowd. Eleanor scanned the faces around her, seeing the beginnings of trust starting to form. It was fragile, but it was there. Late that evening, Eleanor returned to her temporary office at the FBI's command center. The room was quiet now, the hustle of the raid and subsequent investigations replaced by a stillness that allowed her thoughts to catch up with her. Her gaze fell on a file sitting on the edge of her desk. Jason Kane's name was printed on the tab, a stark reminder of the man who had once been at the center of this case. Eleanor opened it, flipping through the pages. Complaints, misconduct reports, warnings, all pieces of a man whose life had spiraled out of control under the weight of a corrupt system. Jason had made his choices, and they had been the wrong ones. But Eleanor couldn't help but wonder if things could have been different. What if someone had intervened earlier? What if the system hadn't enabled his worst instincts? What if he had been given a chance to change before it was too late? She closed the file, her chest heavy. Jason's death had been a stark reminder of the cost of corruption, not just to the victims, but to the perpetrators who became trapped in its web. The next morning, Eleanor walked into the precinct to see a notice board covered with new policies and guidelines. Officers were being retrained, undergoing workshops on de-escalation, bias awareness, and community engagement. Margaret Carter's influence was already being felt, and while the path forward was uncertain, it was clear that progress was being made. Eleanor paused in the main hallway, watching a group of young recruits file into a meeting room. They looked nervous but determined, a stark contrast to the hardened faces of the officers she had encountered during her investigation. She hoped these new recruits would represent the change this department so desperately needed. Before she left the precinct, Eleanor stopped by Margaret Carter's office. Margaret was sitting at her desk, a stack of papers in front of her, but she looked up with a smile when Eleanor entered. "How's it going?" Eleanor asked, leaning against the doorframe. "It's a fight every day," Margaret admitted, "but we're making progress, thanks to you." Eleanor shook her head. "You're the one doing the hard work now. I just lit the match." Margaret smiled faintly, then grew serious. "We're not just fixing a department here. We're trying to rebuild trust. That's the hardest part." Eleanor nodded, understanding all too well. "But it's the most important part. And you're the right person for the job." That evening, Eleanor walked through Millstone Heights, the neighborhood that had been the heart of her investigation. It was quiet now, the streets lit by the soft glow of streetlights. She passed the corner store where she had first encountered Jason Kane and paused, taking in the memory of that night. So much had changed since then. The precinct was under new leadership, the community was beginning to heal, and a system that had once seemed invincible was starting to crumble. But Eleanor knew the work was far from over. Corruption wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. It was a constant battle, one that required vigilance, courage, and persistence. As she stood there, she noticed a group of kids playing basketball on a nearby court. Their laughter echoed in the still night air, a sound full of life and possibility. It was a reminder of what this fight was really about. Not just exposing corruption, but creating a world where these kids could grow up feeling safe and valued. Eleanor smiled and turned to leave, her steps lighter than they had been in months. This case had been a victory, but it was just one chapter in a larger story. There were still battles ahead, but for the first time she felt ready to face them. Eleanor Price's journey was a testament to the power of accountability and the resilience of a community fighting for justice. Through her determination, a corrupt system was exposed, and the first steps toward meaningful reform were taken. The story wasn't over, but it was proof that even in the darkest places, change was possible. It was a reminder that justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about rebuilding trust, creating hope, and paving the way for a better future. As Eleanor walked away from Millstone Heights that night, she carried with her the belief that no system was beyond saving, and no fight was too big to take on. And that belief was enough to keep her going. If this story inspired you, if it reminded you of the power of resilience and truth, please hit that subscribe button. Join us in shining a light on the issues that matter and building a future where accountability and compassion lead the way.